by Secretary Summers this morning when he spoke and talked about the importance of social policy on the whole issue of the economy. And certainly the panel this afternoon must deal with that issue very directly. This conference on the new economy and closing the global divide on education could not be more timely. This week, more than 200 teacher organizations and children's interest groups around the world are launching a campaign to advocate for free and compulsory education for every child. And both the NEA and the AFT are part of this global campaign for education in a global economy, an economy that demands more highly educated and skilled populations than ever before. And certainly all of the panelists on this panel have spoken to that, as well as Chairman Greenspan and the panelists this morning. Obviously, every parent, whether in Tokyo, Topeka, or Togo, knows that education is the critical factor in determining the future of their child, ensuring that every girl and boy on this planet has the opportunity to attend school, to learn the basic needs of reading and numeracy, as well as an understanding of science, will make them much better in whatever opportunities they have, as well as being eventually better parents and citizens. It's a little bit disconcerting that a decade ago, representatives from more than 150 nations met in Thailand and pledged that every child would be able to attend primary school by the year 2000. Regrettably, that goal has been missed, and missed terribly. In 1995, the nations moved the target date to 2015, and we are, I believe, in danger of missing that goal as well unless we really act. Today, as you said, Mr. President, there are about 125 million children out of school. Another 150 million will leave their classrooms where they exist without gaining basic literacy skills. The future of our planet literally rests and lies in the hands of those children. And I don't believe that we can sit by when 1 in 3 people in the developing world is growing up illiterate. We cannot arm 880 million people for competition in a global economy without first helping them achieve basic literacy, not even talking about advanced literacy. Investment in education must be the cornerstone to achieving more rapid and equitable growth around the world. Without this investment, there's no way that we can hope to reduce poverty or to reduce inequalities in economic growth, nor can we develop globalization that is shared and fair. Conquering the global education divide is obviously a very complex issue. We recognize the reality that prevents many countries from providing the most basic education systems. Where there are schools, too many of them lack such essentials as books, maps, computers, or dreams, if even thought of. Some class sizes average anywhere between 80 to 100 students per classroom, and these classrooms are exceedingly small. Too many teachers are poorly trained and poorly paid. In some cases, the rush to keep up with new technology is compounding the education divide. We learned at a recent meeting in the Caribbean, one held just this past February, that more and more governments are investment in technological hardware without training people on how to use it. So technological hardware sits there unused and making a situation even worse. This certainly is a short-handed approach and short-sighted approach, rather, that will not help students gain the skills that they need to succeed in order to move beyond poverty. Another challenge stems from U.S. domination of the software industry. Because the software industry is produced in this country, too often or much of it anyway. Too often people cannot obtain software in their own language or obtain software that is in any way culturally appropriate for the people we're talking about. And when, in fact, that is the case, then it's just not helpful to these folks. We must approach technology intelligently and responsibly. We must also correct problems left standing for far too long. The crisis in world education cannot be attacked without continuing the global march against child labor, which hits girls much more than boys. 2/3 of children out of school are girls. Very often these girls are recruited to work as domestics or in agriculture as early as the age of 4. And such enforced servitude is totally unacceptable and cannot in any way help us to cross this divide. Conquering the global education divide also requires that once we get children into the classroom, we teach them what they will need to compete in the real world and in the real marketplace, which means for many of the developing countries, it's vocational education that is an absolute must. But first, as has been said by many panelists today, we must provide food and basic health care, and the work that's being done by Bill Gates, not only in health care, but also his foundation work in education, is particularly appreciated. In countries where malnutrition is rampant and where vaccines are not readily available for easily preventable diseases, achieving basic education for every child is extremely difficult, if not impossible. If children are not fed or healthy, they cannot think clearly enough to learn. The connection between education, health, and technology is obvious and clear. These are difficult challenges. Guaranteeing a free, compulsory education to every girl and every boy is an enormous undertaking. It will be expensive. It may cost as much as $8 billion a year for the next 10 years to guarantee that every child has the opportunity to learn, but the cost will be much greater if we don't make this commitment to our kids. When you consider that $8 billion is less than what North America spends annually on toys and what the world spends on the military in under 6 days, this investment in our children is money well spent. We in the NEA will kick off this week by talking with about 1,500 to 2,000 of our members who will be meeting in Atlanta this weekend and trying to expand their knowledge on this issue. And you, Mr. President, and Secretary General of the United Nations will probably be getting some postcards and so on from these folks asking that this issue be in the forefront. We will be reaching out to our members to make sure that we understand the true nature of this. Jim Wolfensohn said, education is the key determinant to move people out of their poor conditions in life. There's no question about that. It's also the key determinant in assuring a world of peace and a world of justice. This spring, in April, there will be an education forum in Dakar, Senegal, that will be the successor to the meeting that was held in Thailand. And then in the later part of June, the United Nations will hold a summit on development in Geneva, I believe. I don't believe that any of these meetings, including ours here today, need to establish new targets or promises. What we need to do is develop action plans that will, in fact, make a difference and make things happen. And that will be brought about by partnerships with the people in this room, partnerships with those in civil societies, which we're talking about next. And as an educator and as a citizen of this country, I can't help but believe that we as a nation who is as wealthy and as powerful as we are, cannot do anything but accept our moral responsibility to do what we need to do to make a difference. Thank you.
I want to call on anyone who has a question or a comment from the floor, but first, I'd like to make 4 points very briefly about what our panelists have said, because I find this not only fascinating, but profoundly important to our future. First of all, with regard to the health issue, while I think the vaccine matter is terribly important, we haven't mentioned something that may be even more important: clean water. We should all be investing more in clean water. I visited a West African village on the edge of the desert in Senegal, where Dorothy Height, a great American citizen in her United Council of Negro Women, had joined with our government in building a new well and securing a fresh source of water so that the children could be healthy and there was a sustainable agricultural environment. And all of a sudden, all the young people started coming home from Dakar back to their village to work and live, sort of like what Mariah told you about the Indian village. I think that if you look at the number of children who die from diarrhea every year, it is inconceivable that we can meet this health challenge without both the commitment to the vaccine issue and to clean water. Second point, Dr. Sen talked about the importance of democracy in India and throughout the world. And then you thanked me for going to Rajasthan, and you talked about how backward it used to be. They are convinced, the people in the little village of Naila I visited, that the reason that things are happening is because of the local government law, which was passed a few years ago, which guaranteed that various tribes, various castes, and a certain percentage of women would be represented in every local government. And when I was there in this very poor little village, among other things, I saw that they had a computer that operated in both Hindi and English, and they assured me they had the software to put it into other languages, that even a person with basic literacy skills could operate. And I saw a young mother come in and call up a website from the health department in India on what you should do in your children's first 6 months with very great software visuals, and they had a printer. So she got to print out information that looked to me to be about as good as she could get at a doctor's office here in Chevy Chase. And I will say again, you know, their goal is in the state to have one of these in a public place in every village in the state of Rajasthan within 3 years that has all the information from the national and state government on it. The same principle would apply if you could have one in every village for the school children with a printer. Somebody has to pay for it, somebody has to pay for the paper, but it's still, the economies of scale are much different than they would be otherwise. In Hyderabad, which is a wealthier place, obviously the chief minister there's goal is within a year and a half to have in every village, every state service on the internet. For example, there are, as poor as India is, a lot of people own cars, and you can now get your driver's license over the internet, which, as I've said already a couple of times since I got back, any American governor who did that would find all the term limits laws repealed. He'd be elected for life. I mean, this is very important. So I think we should, I just say this to point out that the local governance works. I also saw in this small village a women's dairy cooperative. They had a simple little machine that tested the fat content of their milk. It doubled their income. They also entered all their transactions on a computer. They got computerized records every week, and they were making lots more money than had ever been made in this modest industry before because of technology and the Women's Self-Help Organization. So I do think democracy and local government have a lot to do with it. The third point I'd like to make is that the reason I wanted Mariah to come here is that in the 7 years I have been president, I've been privileged to represent this country, and as my critics never fail to tire of saying, in more nations than any other president in history. And in every continent I visited, the self-help organizations of poor people are the most impressive groups with whom I have met. And they're overwhelmingly village women. But I'll never forget the people I visited with in Africa, this women's group that ended this genital mutilation practice in their village, and how they brought the handful of men who supported them to meet with me because Hillary had previously met with them. This is very important. I visited with Muhammad Yunus and people from the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, and you talked about the telephone. There, the Grameen Bank is actually trying to finance a cell phone in every village in Bangladesh because they know it's a moneymaker and it connects poor people to the rest of the world. You just think about it, if you had a cell phone and where there is electricity, if you had just one computer with a good screen that easily accessible with good software and a printer, what a difference it could make. The final thing I'd like to say is to echo what Henry Cisneros and what Bob Chase said is the United States and other wealthy countries have got to start looking at this as a form of our future security. We don't spend nearly enough money on this stuff. I said, I'm proud of the fact that AID, since I've been in, we've shifted our emphasis and we financed 2 million microenterprise loans last year. We should have financed 20 million microenterprise loans, or 30 or 50. People come to Mr. Wolfenson all the time, other leaders of developing countries, they want him to finance big power plants and big projects. What we really need to do is to take these things that work to scale. That's what Henry's talking about, and what Bob's talking about. How can we take these things that work to scale? And we've got to build in our country, particularly, a bipartisan consensus that recognizes that we'll get a lot more security out of financing more of these things than we will an extra fighter plane or an extra missile or an extra something else. And I believe I've earned the right to say that because I've supported increases in the defense budget every year I've been here. I've supported improvements in quality of life for the men and women in uniform. But you know, this is pocket change in the United States to make a sea change in the rest of the world. And we have got to develop a global consensus for it. And I think that the wealthy countries also need to consider whether we should increase the financing of the World Bank, because they're in a position, the people who work for the World Bank understand these things, they have the expertise that they should be doing. We don't have to all do it through our national efforts, but anyway, those are my observations. This can be done. I'll say again, the biotechnology of the 21st century and the information technology, if we can take it to scale, can close the divide. And if we don't, it'll get worse. And no matter how you cut it, the wealthy countries are going to have to pony up most of the money. And then the people that run these governments in the developing countries are going to have to understand that the opportunity returns of efforts like yours are greater sometimes than the opportunity returns of big projects that look bigger. The president of one African country, I think is one of the best governed countries in Africa, told me that until I took him to a little village to show him the microenterprise projects, he didn't even know about it. He was too focused on how he was going to get financing for the next power plant. Now, in his defense, ever since then, he's been a great promoter of this. But we've got to start thinking about taking things that work to scale if we really believe that technology can help developing countries leapfrog a whole generation in what was otherwise a predictable and unavoidable pattern of economic development. Who would like to say something? Yes. Please stand up and identify yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Nick Grauf, and I'm the CEO of a company called People PC. My question, I guess, goes to the heart of what we've been talking about. We heard Chairman Greenspan speak of education and knowledge as one of the few irreversible assets. And Mr. Chase, you spent a considerable amount of time talking about this, as did you, Mr. Wolfenson. We spend a tremendous amount of effort monitoring the flow of dollars across the globe, and yet it seems that it's the flow of information and access to information that ultimately drives prosperity, opportunity, et cetera. And I'm wondering if there might be an opportunity for us as a nation and for us perhaps as a global community to begin focusing on how we make access to that information available both to communities here in this country, as Mr. Gates has focused on, but also to communities across the globe. Because I believe if we fail to do that, we will see both an emerging class system in this country not defined by wealth, but defined by access to information, and a class system that will expand globally and potentially create a degree of unrest and discord in an economy that we heard earlier today is constrained currently only by labor markets and the productivity of those labor markets. And I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
Well, Mr. President, I think you know that we're currently working on exactly this issue. We believe from the bank's point of view that money is one asset that can be transferred, but equal with it is information. And so we're looking at the notion of providing what we call a global gateway to information on development, so that the people with computers in the villages or the governments or the local authorities can have access to information which is available here, but more enriching than that, so that the information base that we get can be enriched by experience in the field. The sort of experience that Ms. Chatterjee has application in many places, so that the notion of information flowing out is much enriched by the notion of gathering of information in the field, which is applicable to the conditions in which it's operating. And so the notion that we have is to put together really what amounts to a global alliance, so that for people that are concerned with information needs, whether it be in schools or in local governments or in development institutions or in women's cooperatives, that information can be brought together. And our country is in a magnificent position to give the lead in the methodologies on this, and we're already talking to Bill and a number of others as to how this thing might come together. So your point is very well taken, and it is something in which the United States can take a lead, but which requires international involvement and ownership.
It's already begun when the Telecommunications Act was passed a few years ago, and it included the E-rate, which now is helping to wire schools and libraries in this country. That, believe it or not, has an enormous impact on the access to knowledge for a whole host of kids who just did not have that access before. So it has already begun here. When we start talking about education and the quality of education, not only in this country, but especially for the sake of discussion on this panel, I mean, it's the one resource that can't be taken away from someone. Once someone is educated and learn, they don't lose that knowledge. What you do with it then becomes extraordinarily important. And as our guest from India indicated, the importance of capacity building for people once they gain that knowledge and what can be done with that knowledge is enormous. But that's a key component of capacity building, providing that opportunity for individuals to gain not only knowledge, but knowledge about how to access knowledge and the ability to access that. And I think you hit on a point that's extraordinarily important.
I could just say, I think that if someone from another country were to ask me how they should structure their information dissemination, based on our experience after the Telecom Act, I'd go back to the first conversation I ever had with Vice President Gore about this. And he said, you know, the two things we have to do is make sure that there are discounted rates so that every school, every library, and every hospital can access the information. And the second thing we have to do is to make sure that it's a pro-competition setup so that people, no matter where they are, no matter how meager their resources are, have a chance to succeed as entrepreneurs because they'll have an explosive impact. And those are basically the only two things we fought for in that telecom bill, and I think the results in our country, at least, speak for themselves. Yes, sir, and you had a question back there?
I'm Michael Kramer. I'm a professor of economics at Harvard University, and before that I taught high school in Kenya. As Bill Gates has pointed out, vaccines are one of the key technological challenges facing developing countries, and it's very exciting to see this panel because some of the key steps to increase access to vaccines are being taken by people on the panel. Mr. Gates, the work that your foundation is doing to bring vaccines to children all over the world is literally saving millions of lives. So thank you very much for that work. Mr. Wolfensohn, in a recent Financial Times article, based on an interview with you, there was a statement that the World Bank is planning a $1 billion revolving fund that would help developing countries purchase specified vaccines if and when they're developed or invented. And such a plan could provide incentives for private firms, vaccine or pharmaceutical firms, biotech firms, to invest in developing vaccines for diseases like malaria or tuberculosis, which kill millions of people in developing countries, but for which there wouldn't be a big market in rich countries. And Mr. President, the tax credits that you've proposed could have a major impact. They could effectively double the market for new vaccines for tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV, and in doing so in a way that would harness the energies of the private sector rather than establish a new government bureaucracy to try and develop those vaccines. This would be a plan that would provide these incentives to private firms if they succeed in developing the vaccine and not otherwise. My questions are for Mr. Wolfensohn and for Mr. Gates. For Mr. Wolfensohn, do you expect to bring to your board in the next year a plan based on the ideas that you discussed in the Financial Times interview, which would specifically incorporate a commitment to help purchase vaccines for specified diseases if they're invented? And for Mr. Gates, my question is, if a safe and effective and cost-effective malaria vaccine were developed, do you think that your foundation would be likely to consider buying this and making it available to developing countries? And if so, might you consider announcing this fact in advance as a way of encouraging biotech and pharmaceutical firms to start investing in the R&D that would be necessary to create these vaccines?
Well, the answer to your question is that we are actively considering that issue, and I think you know that it's an incentive which it has been thought may encourage vaccine manufacturers to provide the vaccines. But what we've learned is that it's not just the availability of the vaccine which is the problem. It's the systemic health system which is needed in addition to that to ensure the distribution and delivery of the product. So I believe that it's useful for us to deal with the question of supply of vaccines, but the issue of distribution, delivery, and engagement in health services is, I think, a parallel need that we have. And so we don't underestimate that in Africa, where less than $10 per head is spent per person per year on health. The availability of vaccines is clearly an important issue, and we will be facing it, and we will be bringing it to our board. But I think we shouldn't underestimate, in the case of vaccines or in the case of delivery of retroviral activities for AIDS, which may well come along quite soon in terms of availability, that the systemic problem in terms of many countries is the great inhibitor, even more than the vaccines. So it's both together, and the answer to your question is yes, we will be bringing it to the board, but only in conjunction with systemic reform. Bill?
Yeah, in terms of malaria, you probably know it kills over 1 million children a year. And it's actually fairly scary in the fact that the goals of eliminating malaria have not been achieved. It's actually back in some areas where we thought we'd eliminated it. So we see two roles for the foundation. The first is actually funding malaria research, and we recently put $50 million towards that. And the other is exactly as you suggest, taking this global alliance for vaccines and having it make a commitment to say that when the drug becomes available, that it'll finance for the poorest countries the purchase of that drug. And so it won't just be the recipients of the research money, but anyone who can come up with that solution. That's a tough one because there really isn't much of a market in the developed countries, but I think we will see a response to it, and it's right there at the top of the list.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Judy Brewer. I'm with the World Wide Web Consortium Web Accessibility Initiative. Part of overcoming the digital divide is not only ensuring economic access to the technologies, but ensuring that these technologies are usable by all. Accessible internet and web solutions for people with disabilities who may not be able to see, hear, or manipulate information in standard ways on traditional desktop computers. These accessibility solutions also support device-independent access to information over mobile phones, handheld devices, TV, or automobile access to the web. They also support better internationalization of information, including access to information regardless of somebody's literacy level. Based on the comments today, with the exception of Secretary Summers and Mr. Cisneros, I would guess that the 20% of the US population with disabilities and the millions of people with disabilities internationally are not seen as part of the marketplace of the new economy, nor as one of the largest untapped pools of potential workers for the new economy, and yet we are. Ensuring accessibility of our new technologies is an important way to tap into that dual potential. Among your panelists, for instance, Mr. Gates of Microsoft has been supportive of the Web Accessibility Initiative at W3C. However, implementation of accessibility solutions with Microsoft's own technologies is lagging far behind what is needed. Ensuring economic access to technologies, to inaccessible technologies, still leaves many people behind. Can any of the panelists tell me where this is on your agenda?
I want to talk about this.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm the appropriate person in the context especially of adapting things. But, you know, disability is, of course, one of the things that's been very central in, I'm an academic economist, and I can only respond to that, and it's been a very central concern in my own writings and that of many others, in fact. I mean, I have a book called On Economic Inequality, another called Inequality. We examine much concern with these issues. But you see, I think you are not really asking a question to an academic. I think you'd be very disappointed just to be told that academics are quite interested in it. You want the men of practical world to respond to it. So I think to them I have to turn.
Any response in terms of messaging from any of the parties would be helpful, actually.
Mr. President, I just would add one thought, and that is that I suspect that the issue is going to be even more important given aging trends in our own country and in the industrial world, where a larger proportion of the population will be aged and suffer disabilities, sight and others, stroke, and any number of other things that leave people essentially healthy. Their basic systems allow them to live to 80, 85 years of age, but they will be disabled for a longer period of time or incapacitated for a longer period of time. My guess is this is going to be we know it's going to be a big issue in terms of health systems and medical costs and so forth. It just strikes me that it's probably going to be an issue in terms of information access. That people can live a relatively good quality of life if they can read, if they can get access to them. My father is 82 and suffered a stroke 20 years ago. This year we invested in a device that allows him, he's an avid reader, and just losing his eyesight. So there's devices now that you can magnify the size of print. That's a simple thing. He tries to use a computer. He has a difficult time with it. But my guess is this is going to be a bigger issue as opposed to
But I think, I can only tell you what, for me, I have supported every initiative of which I have been aware that would increase the access of disabled Americans to the workplace. And I believe that technology in this area will become more and more user-friendly, including user-friendly to the disabled. I think there's just as long as there will be, by definition, a market for it, and I think it's terribly important. I noticed, it's interesting you said this, when I was in Mumbai, I stopped, at the 2 different schools for blind students, and said hello to them, and I was thinking about that at the time. But I think on balance, we should see this as a positive thing for the disability community, because it's far more likely to bring more disabled citizens of the world into.
The accessibility comes in many different categories. Making it so that you can use different types of keyboards, that turned out to be a problem that was relatively straightforward to solve. The keyboard, the mouse, getting rid of audio clues that were a problem for people with limited hearing. The one that's been very tough, and I'm very proud of the work we've done, but there's a lot more to do, is dealing with people who have visual limitations. We have things like magnifiers in the product so that if you just need bigger fonts, you can get at it. But the toughest of all is that when the graphical interface was invented, we used that computer screen, and there were a lot of things happening up there that made it tough for, particularly for blind users. We have a lot of relationships. One is with a group in Spain called ONCE. Spain funds programs for blind people probably better than any country. They devoted the lottery, which at the time they may not have realized what a benefit that was going to be, to this organization. And so they've had some really smart people working on this. And so that type of accessibility, we have a long ways to go to have full fidelity there. But even today, there are, in this country, thousands and thousands of people who have jobs because computers and the platform that's been built allows them to get at activities that wouldn't have been possible without technology. So I'd agree with the President. It's an opportunity. It's one that we can't lose sight of. We've got to keep it as a priority. But already I'd say there's fantastic things that have taken place. We're also the creator of a group of employers that have gotten together to make sure there's visibility, so to speak, of the fact that there are these people with these talents, and what are the barriers to helping to get them into the workforce. There's just the energy has not gone into that, and so even once the technology's there, getting the focus on the hiring has turned out to be important as well.
Yes, I just want to say that I chaired my first conference on technical aids for the disabled 20 years ago. And when I came to this job, I discovered that the issue of disabilities in developing countries starts at a very, very low level. So that the notion of jumping to use of computers to the creation of job opportunities is a monumental leap. What we're working on at the moment is the issue of getting services provided for the disabled in many of the countries in which we're operating. The very poorest countries are not providing for people with disabilities in mobility, wheelchairs, or the most basic requirements in terms of hearing and visual impairment. The thing that we're trying to do is to try and build allocations of health and other social services for persons with disabilities. I do not exclude the use of technology. In fact, I welcome the opportunity, but I don't underestimate in many of the countries in which we're dealing, and would hope that you might bring some action on it as well, that stage one is to get recognition in many of the countries of the grouping of persons with disabilities as having special needs. And I must tell you that that is quite tough in many of the places in which we're operating.
If I may, and reply for one sentence. Sorry.
Very briefly, there is probably no other public institution that is doing more in this area than public schools. Not enough. So I want to make sure that's understood. And part of this is a result of IDEA that was passed 25 years ago. What we are seeing in many schools, still not enough, many schools, is the use of technology to meet those needs of disabled students that have in fact been highlighted through the use of IDEA and IEPs and the whole process there. Still not enough, but moving certainly in the right direction.
I have to bring this to a close, but let me tell you what I'm going to do here. We're going to have about a 15-minute break between now and the start of the final session. And what I would like to encourage you to do, if you have more questions, is to come up and talk to our panelists during the 15 minutes. But I want to close by giving our guests who've come the furthest away a chance to answer this question. Dr. Sen and Ms. Chatterjee, if you had $2 or $3 billion to spend on this topic, closing the global divide, how would you spend it? Just in India.
First want to hear Mirai on that.
Let's go first. Well, if we had that kind of money, two or three things. As I said, we believe in the convergence of these different activities to close the divide. So one thing we would definitely do is to try and use that as a revolving fund to help women develop their small businesses and their employment, and also promote capitalization, and also encourage them to get some sort of social protection, some sort of social security. But we would also put it into developing information technology and the idea of vocational schools, which we are developing very much. So education, but with the support of information and technology.
Well, I agree with that answer. In a very tiny way, I use my Nobel money to start up a educational foundation for especially for girls, but mainly for rural children. It's of course a tiny amount of money in comparison. I mean, in this table with Bill Gates around, one shouldn't even mention numbers like that. But I think that to a great extent was based on the idea that there are three priorities I put there. One was the elementary education. The other was elementary health care, including the point you mentioned about clean water being one of the central aspects of that. And third was gender inequality, which I think is a big prime mover of change. I think if there are changes that we're going to see in the developing world, perhaps nothing is as important as the access of women to the economic opportunities like microcredit, employment opportunities, in which of course Mirai herself is very strongly involved, but also education and so on. And the radical change that women's education has brought out. You see, India is very interesting if you contrast it. For example, Mirai mentioned that infant mortality has come down from, say, 145 to 172. Now, if you take a part of the country where education is more well-developed, like Kerala, the infant mortality is 14, compared with, say, China's 30. So, you know, you're really dealing, you see the impact. It's not only education, but I think that's the primary factor. I think the difference that women's education can make is really truly dramatic. So I would have thought possibly these three priorities is the direction I would go.
Last comment for Mr. Gates. The information technology revolution has created more billionaires in America in less time than ever before. And we have just scads of people worth $200 million, which to people like me is real money. And what could I do as president, or what could we do to encourage more philanthropy, like the kind the Gates Foundation has manifested? And what can we do to make sure that we leverage all this so that there's some synergy in the movement of the philanthropic world toward this? You know, 100 years ago when J.P. Morgan and all these people made all their fortunes, they built great monuments to our culture, the great museums, the great public, the great libraries, great thing. But now we have all these younger people who've made lots of money who really want to transform society itself, really without precedent. We've always had some foundations that were interested in doing this, but the potential we have to leverage private wealth here through philanthropy to transform society, I think, is without precedent in history. What can we do to see that there are more efforts like the one you're making?
I think that's a very good question, and it's one that I think about a lot and don't have as good an answer as I'd like to have. There are some foundations that have a lot of resources that are starting to do some exciting things. The Packard Foundation is fantastic. The Eli Lilly Foundation, the Wellcome Foundation over in the UK. And all these new foundations are learning a lot from the existing foundations, people like the Rockefeller Foundation that have been out there doing fantastic things for decades and decades. That still doesn't really get into this new generation of success and how we can make it exciting for those people to get involved. I have to say that as I've learned more about it, I've gotten more excited myself. So a little bit I just need to reach out and spread that excitement. You know, when you're making money, it keeps you very busy. It's really a full-time thing. And sometimes you think, boy, does all that giving really have an impact? Is it money well spent or not? Because your whole job is to be skeptical about, what things really have impact and what don't. And I'm pleased to find out that, philanthropy, if it's done the right way, can have a phenomenal impact, and everybody gets to pick their own area. As we've seen on this panel, there's not going to be a shortage. If these people turn to philanthropy, it's not going to be something where we say, no, that's all taken care of. And so, how can we encourage them? I don't know. I need to think about that some more. I think there's some leadership to be exercised here.
Let's give them all a hand. We'll take a 15-minute break. Thank you. That was great. The final panel today is one of particular importance to me, at least, and that is how can the new economy tools empower civil society and government? And I'm going to call on Esther Dyson first, the founder and chairman of Adventure Holdings, because she has to catch a plane. But you can go first anyway. Okay. So there.
Okay, I'm going to try and set a good example by being relatively brief. And what that means is that I can also make my points fairly blunt, which is what I'd like to do. I have two roles here. One, I'm chairman of Adventure Holdings. I'm an industry observer, and I invest in small startups. I'm also chairman of ICANN, which is a new form of agents, if you like, that manages the technical structure of the internet. It's international. And I may talk about that briefly at the end, or if people have questions. To me, can new economy tools empower civil society and government? In some senses, the wrong question. What they can really do is they can empower people as individuals and citizens. A lot of what you hear about in the rhetoric about the new economy is, isn't this great, we're going to empower consumers. And what that usually means is, oh great, we have tools to get their attention with so they can buy more stuff, and they can choose from among more different brands, and they can see different pricing options. But what's really exciting about these tools is that they empower people to make choices for themselves also, again, as citizens and as producers. The interesting thing about the internet is that it's two-way. It's a feedback loop. The very short form of this is broadcast TV, government, media. Those are all good for propaganda, whether good or bad. And the internet is good for conspiracy, whether good or bad. And so the cool thing about the internet is that it actually has a lot more impact outside the United States. The United States as an economy is relatively efficient. Economically, it has trade shows, it has catalogs, it has 800 numbers, it has faxes, it has the SEC and corporate financial statements. A lot of countries don't have that. And so outside the United States also, a lot of people don't have, you might like it, a good opportunity to talk back to their government. And that's what the internet gives them, for better or worse. And it's tremendously exciting. Now, this also has a bad side, and that is it empowers individuals to do bad. And it fosters fragmentation of society. If everybody's watching the same news programs, good or bad, at least they're united. At least they have a common history. So as we look to what the internet does, it's not all good, but I do think the preponderance of it is good. What I'd like to do now is just give 3 specific examples of what I'm talking about. The first you're going to hear more about, it's GovWorks. And what GovWorks does is it doesn't go and make contracts with government organizations. It goes out and it markets to citizens, and then it helps the citizens in dealing with the governments. It applies the economies of scale that once belonged only to big business and other big institutions on behalf of individuals. And then there's another even more interesting phenomenon. there's a website called payusback.com. Great name. What PayUsBack does is the following. If you send a FedEx or an airborne package, usually you get a guarantee of delivery time. But unless you really have nothing better to do, you're probably not monitoring your package on the web, even though it's possible to do so. And so you don't get a refund if it's 10 minutes late, maybe not even if it's a day late, because you're probably a PR guy and you don't care when it gets there. It just should go in the FedEx package and look important. But payusback.com says, we'll monitor all your packages for you, because we do it automatically, and we'll get you your refund. Now, the first order impact is money changes hands. Second, FedEx and the other guys have to change their guarantees. But the third impact is you're going to have more transparency, because someday PayUsBack or somebody else is going to start publishing the statistics. Who's better, FedEx or airborne? And so you have more and more this phenomenon of private companies taking on what used to be government-like functions. They rate things, they provide recourse, they help inform consumers, they even enforce basically consumer, vendor, or even citizen government transactions. And for example, if I buy something over the web and I don't like it, I'm not going to call the FTC. I'm not even going to call the something something in France. I'm going to call American Express or Visa. And so what you're really talking about in this new world is the rise of alternative agencies that often represent citizens as individuals, but with more power than individuals often have. A final point I'd like to make, again, is about empowering people not as consumers, but as producers. I think when you talk about, you can talk about philanthropy, but you can also talk about enlightened long-term self-interest. And I'm not sure how much difference there is between the two. I think one of the most interesting phenomena in the last few months has been Ford's and Delta's programs to buy PCs and provide internet access for their employees. Because that sends a very interesting message. It says, we value you not just as workers in our plants, but we value you as individuals. We value you as intellectual human beings. Yes, we want to invest in you and make you better informed and better educated. We want to help you improve the lives of your children. But it sends a very different message to employees from simply giving them more money. And I think that's the kind of thing I'd like to see encouraged. So with those opening remarks,
Thank you.
I'm done.
I think it would be good now to, I'll just go over to Khalil Tuzman, the co-founder and CEO of GovWorks.com, to talk, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was looking at the question posed to the panel here once again a few moments ago, and I thought the answer of whether the new economy tools will be empowering to civil society and government seems self-evident, because I have the great pleasure to be sitting next to Professor Putnam, who used to be the dean of the School of Government, where I was intended to finish my graduate studies and didn't. So I feel particularly empowered. In previous reflection, and I say this without the intent to offend anybody in the room, the question here made me think as well of Aristotle's comment that a man's life is at its beginning and end marked by the search for truth, and everything in the middle is politics. And I think that the internet and the tools of the new economy, like the printing press and like the radio, like the telephone, like the TV, will fundamentally change politics and governance more than probably anything else. And I think that really that launches into really the answer, or at least one way to answer the question, and that is really to separate out politics and governance. Politics really encompassing kind of civil society, if you will, and governance being the administrative function of government. And in terms of civil society, the question of empowerment is really difficult to disentangle, because I think that, in certain ways there are obvious paths to empowerment that are engendered by the tools of the internet, the digital economy or the new economy. And I break those tools down into two different general areas. I'm sure other people would have other definitions. One is the technology and access, the use of the widget, if you will, of the internet. And the other is the equity ownership in this IT revolution. And they're both can be tremendously empowering when it comes to democratic representation. I mean, there's nothing that can fulfill really atomic level representative democracy like the internet, really at all of our desktops, of course, if we have access. And there's nothing that can empower in a more direct way than equity participation. And so there's enormous promise. At the same time, I may be striking a bit of a more somber chord here than in other discussions today, but it can also be extraordinarily disempowering, as if people don't have access and don't have equity ownership, then in fact, as other panelists have noted today, then it can have the reverse effect of expanding socioeconomic divides. A few weeks ago, there was a Silicon Alley, which is still not as well known as our counterparts on the West Coast. In New York, there was a publication that listed many of the top internet companies in New York, and there was one company on that list that was Latino-owned, and there were no companies that were African-American owned. And we at GovWorks are one of the only companies that have been funded, VC funded, that are not ethnically targeted, that are not internet companies that are targeted at ethnic communities, which are great businesses, but don't expand the reach of equity participation as they need to. So there are disempowering elements as well. On the side of governance, and I hope you'll forgive the kind of what may sound like a plug, but given the President's comment at the last panel around governors getting their DMV registrations online, that is what we do. And there are a whole host of others out there that have begun to follow our example in the marketplace of helping states and counties and cities get transactional, get interactional online quickly. And this, I think, goes to Esther's reference as well to kind of public-private sector partnerships, or the outsourcing, the privatization effect of the internet, if you will, in governance. There's a recent IBM e-government Institute study that claimed that using today's transactional online processes, there's $143 billion of savings inherent in applying that to government processes like permitting and licensing, transactional processes, collections, everything from child support to paying a real estate tax. And it's really quite simple, and that's an extraordinarily important part of what's going on in the new economy and how it can affect all of our lives. I guess to follow Esther's example and wrap quickly, the last note, I guess, again, will be on the more sober side, and that is, in another era, de Tocqueville said that the proper functioning of American democracy is primarily inhibited by the prevalence of American illiteracy. And it was really a prescient comment that I think was probably a contribution to things like major civil strife in this country, both on the battlefield and in our urban centers. And if we don't take that lesson to heart again in this era, and what literacy means today is training for children on how to use the internet effectively, vocational training, as one of the earlier panelists said, universal access and expansion of equity participation, then we will fall into the same trap again.
Thank you. Thanks. I'd like to now call on William Julius Wilson, who is now a professor of social policy at Harvard at the JFK School, and who's been very generous with his time to me and to this administration over the last 7 years, and who I think better than anyone else I know chronicled the disappearance of work for minority males in inner cities as the economy changed and as jobs moved to the suburbs, and the implications that had for economic and social dislocation and racial tensions in our country. And so I think the title of his last book was When Work Disappears.
That wasn't my last one, so it gives me a chance to plug the last one, which is The Bridge Over the Racial Divide.
Yeah, oh, I got that one.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much, Mr.
Try to hawk all his
Thank you very much, Mr. President. It's really an honor to be here.